The chill of late autumn 1944 clung to the air, a pervasive dampness that seeped into bone and spirit. The Ardennes Forest, usually a place of quiet, ancient beauty, now hummed with a different kind of energy, a suppressed tension that promised to erupt. In a small, dimly lit farmhouse far from any discernible front line, a man sat alone. His name was Sergeant John Miller. Tonight, for John, was not just another night. It was the last night he would spend believing the war was on a predictable path, the last night before a battle that would redefine his understanding of survival, heroism, and the very nature of conflict. What secrets did that final, quiet evening hold? How did a seemingly ordinary soldier prepare for an extraordinary, unforeseen onslaught that would forever etch itself into the annals of history? Join us as we unravel the mystery of John Miller's last night before destiny. If you're intrigued by the untold stories of courage and the hidden moments that shape history, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on our deep dives into the past. John, a man whose face bore the lines of 27 years, a prematurely aged map of quiet resilience, stared into the flickering flame of a single kerosene lamp. Its warm, unsteady glow cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, illuminating faded photographs of his wife, Sarah, and their young son, Thomas. Their smiles, frozen in time, were a stark contrast to the grim reality outside. He traced the outline of Sarah's face with a calloused thumb, a silent ritual he performed every night, a tether to a world that felt increasingly distant. The air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and damp earth, a familiar cocktail of wartime living. His unit, a small reconnaissance patrol, had been holed up in this abandoned farm for 3 days, tasked with monitoring a seemingly quiet sector of the Western Front. The intelligence reports painted a picture of a German army in retreat, demoralized and depleted. A dangerous complacency had begun to settle over the Allied lines, a quiet confidence that the end was near. But John, a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, harbored a persistent, nagging unease. He'd seen enough to know that war rarely followed the script. He pulled a worn, leather-bound journal from his pack, its pages filled with his neat, disciplined script. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense, but a meticulously kept log of observations, sketches of terrain, and tactical notes. Tonight, however, he wrote something different. December 15th, 1944. The stillness is unnerving, too quiet. My gut tells me something is wrong. The men are restless, dreaming of home. I try to share their optimism, but a shadow lingers. Sarah, Thomas, I pray for your safety and for mine. May God grant us strength for whatever tomorrow brings. He paused, the pen hovering over the page. He considered adding a sentiment about the impending Christmas, a fleeting thought of carols and warm fires, but felt it too frivolous for the moment. The stark reality of his surroundings pulled him back. Outside, the wind howled softly, a mournful song through the skeletal trees. Sergeant John Miller rose, his movements fluid despite the fatigue etched into his frame. He moved to the single window, its panes grimy with years of neglect. He peered out into the impenetrable darkness, a vast, oppressive void that swallowed the distant whispers of the night. He saw nothing, yet felt everything. The absence of sound was almost more terrifying than any distant gunfire. His training, honed over years of combat, screamed at him. This was not the silence of peace, but the quiet before the storm. Such premonitions are often dismissed as mere anxiety, the burden of leadership. But for John, they were a compass, guiding him through the treacherous landscape of war. How many times had that internal compass saved him, or his men? He walked through the small farmhouse checking on his men. Private Thompson, a fresh-faced 19-year-old from Ohio, was asleep, his rifle clutched tight. Corporal Davies, a grizzled Scotsman with a dry wit, was cleaning his garand, the rhythmic click-clack a comforting sound in the silence. Specialist Garcia, the unit's medic, was quietly mending a tear in his field jacket. Each man, in his own way, was preparing for an uncertain tomorrow, though none could articulate the true nature of that uncertainty. John exchanged a few quiet words with Davies, a veteran's shorthand of shared understanding. "Anything out there, Corporal?" John asked, his voice a low rumble. Davies shook his head. "Just the wind, Sergeant, and my own thoughts, which ain't much company tonight." A grim smile flickered across John's face. He understood. He returned to his perch by the lamp, his journal open. He began to draw, not maps or tactical positions, but a rough sketch of a bird, a robin, perched on a branch, its head cocked as if listening. It was an image from his childhood, a memory of a peaceful morning in his backyard. This simple act of drawing, a momentary escape, reveals a deeper truth about the human spirit in times of extreme pressure. It's not just about survival, but about holding on to the fragments of what makes life worth living. What sustains a soldier when faced with the unimaginable? Is it the thought of home, the camaraderie of his unit, or something more profound, something deeply personal? He remembered a conversation he'd had with Sarah before he deployed. She had asked him, her eyes brimming with a mixture of fear and pride, "What do you think about out there, John? When it's quiet?" He had hesitated, not wanting to burden her with the grim realities. "I think about you, Sarah, and Thomas, and I think about what we're fighting for." It was a partial truth, a comforting lie. The full truth was far more complex, a tapestry woven with fear, duty, camaraderie, and a bone-deep weariness. Sometimes in the quiet he thought about nothing at all, a desperate attempt to empty his mind of the horrors he had witnessed. Other times the memories flooded him, unbidden and relentless. Tonight the memories were of peace, of home, of a future he desperately hoped to reclaim. The ticking of his wristwatch, a gift from Sarah, was the loudest sound in the room. Each second seemed to stretch, to amplify the profound stillness outside. He thought about the men under his command. Thompson, so young, so eager. Davies, a rock of experience, dependable as the sunrise. Garcia, whose gentle hands had saved countless lives. He felt a profound sense of responsibility for them, a burden that weighed heavier than any physical load. He was their shield, their guide, their last line of defense. The lives of these men, their hopes and dreams, rested on his shoulders. This is the unseen weight of command, often overlooked in the grand narratives of war. John closed his journal, placing it carefully back in his pack. He then pulled out a small, well-worn book of poetry. It was a collection of Tennyson, his father's favorite. He opened it to a familiar page. Ulysses. He read the lines silently, the words echoing in the quiet room. "Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive to seek, to find, and not to yield." The words resonated deeply within him. They spoke of endurance, of an unyielding spirit in the face of adversity. This was not just poetry. It was a creed, a silent promise to himself and to his men. He practiced a few silent drills, checking his rifle, ensuring his ammunition was easily accessible. Every movement was precise, economical, born of countless repetitions. His uniform, though stained and worn, was meticulously maintained. These small acts of discipline, performed in the quiet hours before dawn, were not merely about preparedness. They were a form of meditation, a way to focus the mind, to banish doubt. They were a soldier's prayer. The methodical nature of these preparations, the unwavering attention to detail, hints at a deeper understanding of the unpredictable nature of combat. It's in these small, seemingly mundane actions that true readiness is forged. As the first faint streaks of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. The wind died down, replaced by an eerie calm. The air grew colder, sharper, biting. John felt it, a prickle on the back of his neck. He stood up, fully alert now, his senses heightened. He moved to the window again, his eyes scanning the horizon. The forest, once a dark, indistinct mass, was slowly beginning to reveal its contours, its stark, skeletal branches reaching towards the nascent light. Still, nothing. No sound. No movement. But the feeling, that persistent, gnawing unease, intensified. It was a silence that screamed. He roused his men quietly, a soft tap on the shoulder, a whispered word. They woke instantly, accustomed to the abrupt transitions from sleep to full alertness. There was no need for explanations. The unspoken understanding of soldiers, forged in the crucible of shared experience, transcended words. They knew instinctively that something was different this morning. The air crackled with an unspoken tension. They ate a meager breakfast of hardtack and lukewarm coffee, the silence punctuated only by the clinking of mess kits. Each man moved with a quiet efficiency, their faces grim, expectant. Thompson, the youngest, looked particularly pale. John caught his eye, offering a slight, reassuring nod. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. It said, "I'm here. We're in this together." The strength of a unit often lies not in grand speeches, but in these quiet moments of shared support. Just as the sun began to peek over the distant tree line, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a low rumble began to emanate from the east. It was faint at first, a distant tremor, barely perceptible, but it grew, slowly, steadily, a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the earth, through their very bones. The men exchanged worried glances. This was not the sound of distant artillery fire. This was something else, something larger, more ominous. John rushed to the radio, frantically trying to raise command. The static crackled, a frustrating symphony of white noise. "Delta 6 to command, do you read? Over," he barked into the receiver. Only static responded. The communication lines were dead. A cold dread seeped into his gut. This was not just an attack. It was a surprise, a complete breakdown of intelligence. The enemy had achieved total operational surprise. The rumble intensified, transforming into a thunderous roar. The ground began to shake. Then, through the trees, a dark, menacing shape emerged. Then another, and another. Tanks. German tanks. Panzerafors, their long barrels glinting in the pale morning light. Behind them, columns of infantry, their gray uniforms a stark contrast against the snow-dusted landscape. The sheer scale of the force was overwhelming. This was not a skirmish. This was an invasion. John's mind raced, processing the impossible. The German army, supposedly on its last legs, had launched a massive offensive. This was it. The mystery of the unnerving silence, the persistent unease, was solved. The quiet before the storm had given way to the storm itself, a tempest of steel and fire. The Battle of the Bulge, though they didn't know its name then, had begun. He turned to his men, his voice steady despite the tremor in the ground. "All right, listen up, they're coming. We hold this position as long as we can, we buy time. Every minute counts. Thompson, you're on the bar. Davies, with me on the anti-tank. Garcia, set up. The aid station in the cellar. Remember your training, stay calm, and fight like hell." There was no panic in his voice, only a steely resolve. The time for questions, for introspection, was over. The time for action had arrived. The first shells began to fall, tearing through the quiet morning air, exploding with deafening roars that shook the farmhouse to its foundations. Shrapnel ripped through the walls, sending splinters flying. The peaceful farmhouse, a refuge just moments before, was now a death trap. The battle had begun. John Miller, the man who had spent the night wrestling with premonitions and clinging to memories of home, was now fully immersed in the brutal reality of war. The last night before destiny was over. His destiny, and the destiny of countless others, was now being forged in fire. The initial shock of the German offensive, later known as the Ardennes Offensive or the Battle of the Bulge, sent ripples of disbelief and chaos throughout the Allied lines. John's small reconnaissance unit, isolated and outgunned, found itself at the spearhead of a massive, unforeseen enemy thrust. The quiet farmhouse, once a sanctuary, became a crucible. The mystery of the preceding night dissolved into the stark, terrifying reality of combat. The silence which had so unnerved John was now replaced by the cacophony of war, the roar of tanks, the crack of rifles, the scream of shells, and the cries of men. His orders were clear. Hold the position. Buy time. Every minute they could delay the German advance was a minute gained for the Allied forces to reorganize, to understand the scale of the attack, and to mount a defense. John, with his small band of soldiers, became a tiny, defiant dam against a raging flood. Corporal Davies, his Scottish brogue now laced with a grim determination, positioned the anti-tank gun at the edge of the tree line, its cold steel barrel aimed at the approaching panzers. Private Thompson, despite his youth and visible fear, took up his position with the Browning automatic rifle, bar, his hands trembling but his eyes focused. Specialist Garcia, true to his calling, transformed the farmhouse cellar into a makeshift aid station, preparing bandages and morphine, his face a mask of quiet resolve. The first German tank, a Panzer IV, lumbered into view, its tracks grinding against the frozen earth. Its turret traversed, the long gun seeking targets. John, sighting down the anti-tank weapon, felt a surge of adrenaline, a cold, sharp focus that cut through the fear. "Davies, target the tracks, aim for the drive sprocket," he yelled over the din. Davies, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, nodded, making minute adjustments. The anti-tank gun roared, spitting fire and smoke. The shell streaked across the snowy ground, striking the Panzer's track with a clang of metal. The tank lurched, its forward momentum broken, a geyser of sparks erupting from its side. It was a temporary victory, a small dent in the overwhelming force. More tanks followed, accompanied by waves of German infantry, their shouts echoing across the field. The farm became a focal point of intense fighting. Thompson's bar chattered, laying down suppressive fire, forcing the enemy to seek cover. John moved between his men, offering encouragement, relaying orders, his presence a steadying force amidst the chaos. He fired his M1 Garand with practiced efficiency, each shot carefully aimed, each round a testament to his unwavering commitment. The smell of cordite and burning fuel began to fill the air, mingling with the scent of damp earth and fear. Hours blurred into an agonizing eternity. The farm, once a symbol of quiet respite, was now a shattered ruin. Shells had torn through its roof, crumbling its walls. The cellar, where Garcia tended to the wounded, offered the only semblance of shelter. John found himself in a desperate dance with death, constantly moving, constantly evaluating, constantly fighting. He saw the toll on his men. Thompson, his face now grim and hardened, his eyes wide with the horror of what he was witnessing. Davies, his usual banter replaced by a focused intensity, his movements precise and deadly. Garcia, his uniform stained with blood, his face pale but his hands steady as he worked. The Germans, relentless in their assault, pressed forward. Their numbers seemed inexhaustible. John knew their position was untenable. The objective was not to win the battle here, but to delay, to bleed the enemy, to buy precious time. He made a difficult decision. "We're pulling back," he shouted, his voice hoarse from yelling. "Fall back to the tree line. Garcia, get the wounded ready." The retreat was orderly, disciplined, a testament to their training and John's leadership. They moved under a hail of enemy fire, each man covering the other, a tight-knit unit bound by shared danger and mutual trust. They reached the relative safety of the dense forest, regrouping behind a thick stand of pines. The sounds of battle, though still pervasive, were now slightly muffled by the trees. John took a moment to assess his men. Miraculously, all were accounted for, though several had superficial wounds. Their faces were grim, exhausted, but their spirits, though battered, remained unbroken. They had done their job. They had held the line, however briefly, against overwhelming odds. The mystery of the preceding night, the silent anticipation, had been replaced by the brutal understanding of what it meant to face an enemy determined to break through. Over the next few days, John and his unit found themselves caught in the swirling vortex of the Battle of the Bulge. They were no longer a reconnaissance patrol, but a small, mobile fighting force, constantly moving, constantly engaging the enemy, constantly trying to understand the larger picture of the unfolding offensive. They witnessed acts of incredible bravery and unspeakable horror. They saw entire units overrun, supply lines severed, and the grim reality of winter warfare. The strategic surprise of the German attack had plunged the Western Front into chaos, creating a bulge in the Allied lines that threatened to split their forces. John's journal, once a place for quiet reflection, became a grim chronicle of survival. He scribbled notes in snatched moments, detailing engagements, mapping enemy movements, and recording the names of fallen comrades. The entries were terse, factual, stripped of the earlier introspection. Deck 18th. Ambushed enemy patrol near Bastogne. Took out 2 vehicles. Thompson distinguished himself. Davies wounded minor. Garcia patched him up. Morale holding but supplies low. Cold is brutal. The poetry book remained in his pack, unread. There was no time for reflection, only for action, for survival. The weather turned even colder, bringing with it heavy snowfall that blanketed the Ardennes, making movement difficult and visibility poor. The snow, initially a beautiful, pristine white, quickly became stained with blood and churned into mud by tanks and troop movements. Frostbite became as much a threat as enemy fire. John and his men, like thousands of other Allied soldiers, endured unimaginable hardships, fighting not just the enemy, but the elements themselves. The logistical nightmare of the offensive meant that supplies were scarce, food was rationed, and warmth was a distant memory. One particularly harrowing encounter took place near a small crossroads village, a strategic point that the Germans were desperate to secure. John's unit, now augmented by a few stragglers from other shattered companies, found themselves defending a cluster of ruined buildings. The fighting was house to house, brutal and unforgiving. John, leading from the front, displayed extraordinary courage and tactical acumen. He coordinated their defense, directing fire, identifying enemy positions, and inspiring his men through sheer force of will. He saw Thompson, no longer the fresh-faced kid, but a hardened soldier, firing his bar with deadly precision, his fear replaced by a cold, controlled anger. He saw Davies, despite his wound, fighting with the ferocity of a cornered badger, his bayonet flashing in the dim light, and Garcia, moving fearlessly under fire, tending to the wounded, his gentle hands now stained with the grim realities of his profession. During a brief lull in the fighting, John found himself sheltering in a collapsed barn, its wooden beams splintered and broken. He looked at his men, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. They were dirty, cold, and utterly spent, yet they still stood, ready to fight. A profound sense of pride, laced with a deep sorrow, welled up within him. He had brought them through the initial onslaught, through days of relentless combat. But the end was still not in sight. The mystery of the war, its unpredictable twists and turns, continued to unfold around them. The Battle of the Bulge raged for weeks, a brutal testament to the ferocity of the German counteroffensive and the resilience of the Allied forces. John Miller's unit, though small, played its part in slowing the enemy, in providing crucial intelligence, and in holding key positions against impossible odds. Their actions, though largely unrecorded in the grand narratives of the war, were vital. They were the unsung heroes who bought the time necessary for the Allied command to regroup, to bring in reinforcements, and to finally push back the German offensive. As January 1945 approached, the tide slowly began to turn. Allied air superiority, hampered by bad weather in the initial stages of the offensive, finally reasserted itself. Supplies began to reach the beleaguered front lines, and fresh troops arrived. The bulge in the Allied lines began to recede, slowly but surely. The German offensive, though a shock, ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives. John and his men, though still in the thick of the fighting, felt a subtle shift in the air. The relentless pressure began to ease. The enemy attacks became less frequent, less intense. The sounds of Allied artillery, once distant and sporadic, now echoed with a reassuring regularity. The mystery of their initial isolation and the overwhelming enemy surprise began to unravel, replaced by the grim satisfaction of having held their ground. One cold, gray morning, after weeks of relentless combat, John received orders to pull back to a designated rest area behind the newly consolidated front lines. The journey there was a slow, arduous one, through snow-choked roads and devastated landscapes. But for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of relief, a collective exhale. They had survived. When they finally reached the designated area, a small, intact village far from the front, John allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He found a relatively untouched corner in a barn, away from the chatter of other soldiers, and pulled out his journal. The pages were now stained with dirt and grime, some torn, but the words remained. He read his entry from December 15th, the night before the battle that changed everything. My gut tells me something is wrong. The stillness is unnerving, too quiet. He smiled grimly. His gut had been right. He then wrote a new entry, his hand trembling slightly from exhaustion. January 20th, 1945, we made it. The bulge is broken. Saw things I'll never forget. Lost good men, but we held. Thompson, Davies, Garcia. They fought like lions. The cost was immense, but we survived. Sarah, Thomas, I'm coming home. Someday. The silence now feels different. Not the quiet before the storm, but the quiet after. A fragile peace, but a peace nonetheless. He closed the journal, its weight a comforting presence in his hands. The last night before destiny had been a night of quiet apprehension, a premonition of the storm to come. The experience of the Battle of the Bulge had transformed John Miller, and every man who fought alongside him. They had faced the unknown, endured unimaginable hardships, and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. The mystery of that quiet night had given way to the stark reality of war, but it had also revealed the depth of human courage, resilience, and the enduring power of hope. John Miller's story, like countless others from the Battle of the Bulge, is a testament to the individual sacrifices that collectively shaped the course of history. It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit can endure, adapt, and ultimately prevail. The quiet moments before the storm, the unspoken fears, the deep personal reflections, these are the threads that weave into the larger tapestry of war, often overlooked but profoundly impactful. The Battle of the Bulge, a desperate gamble by the Axis powers, ultimately became one of the most significant Allied victories of World War II, though at a tremendous cost. It demonstrated the unwavering resolve of the Allied soldiers even when faced with total surprise and brutal winter conditions. John Miller's last night before destiny was not just a personal experience. It was a microcosm of the larger historical event, a single soldier's journey through the heart of one of the war's most pivotal battles. His story reminds us that history is not just about grand strategies and sweeping movements, but about the individual lives caught in the maelstrom, their quiet courage, and their enduring hope for a return to peace. If you found John Miller's story compelling and wish to explore more about the raw human experiences that define wartime, please like this video, share it with others, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these vital, often untold stories to light. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. The silence before the storm, The profound stillness that descended upon the Ardennes Forest on the eve of December 16, 1944, was not a vacuum of sound, but a dense, heavy presence. It was a silence pregnant with the unspoken, a collective breath held across miles of snow-laden trees and frozen ground. For men like John Miller, this wasn't merely the absence of noise. It was an almost palpable entity, a premonition that settled deep in their bones, sharper than the biting cold. They had grown accustomed to the cacophony of war, the distant rumble of artillery, the staccato crackle of small arms fire, the incessant drone of aircraft overhead. This sudden, unnatural quiet was far more unsettling, a grand orchestral pause before a terrifying crescendo. This last night before destiny, as Miller would later describe it, wasn't just a physical experience. It was a deeply psychological one. The routine of war, brutal as it was, provided a certain framework, a predictable rhythm of survival. But that night, the rhythm was broken. The soldiers, huddled in their foxholes or makeshift shelters, were left with their thoughts, their fears, and the chilling certainty that something monumental was about to break. It was in these quiet moments that the true weight of their situation pressed down upon them. Families back home, girlfriends, wives, children, faces flickered in the darkness, vivid and poignant, a stark contrast to the desolate landscape around them. Each man, in his own way, confronted the possibility that this might be his last night, a silent reckoning with mortality. The cold itself was an antagonist, a constant, insidious threat. The Ardennes winter was notoriously brutal, with temperatures plummeting far below freezing, often accompanied by heavy snowfall. Frostbite was a common enemy, as debilitating as any German bullet. The soldiers' breath froze in the air, their fingers and toes growing numb despite layers of wool and canvas. The simple act of staying warm became an all-consuming struggle, diverting precious energy and attention from the impending combat. This environmental hostility amplified the psychological strain, creating an atmosphere of profound discomfort and anxiety. The quiet night was not just cold. It was a cold that seeped into their very souls, a physical manifestation of the dread that permeated the air. Moreover, the intelligence blackout added another layer to the unnerving quiet. Allied command, lulled into a false sense of security by earlier intelligence assessments and the belief that the Germans were incapable of launching a major offensive, had largely dismissed the possibility of such a large-scale attack. This intelligence failure meant that the men on the front lines, particularly those in the thinly spread American sectors of the Ardennes, were operating in a void of information. They had no clear picture of the enemy's strength, their intentions, or the sheer scale of the force massing against them. This lack of knowledge, combined with the eerie silence, fostered an environment of heightened paranoia. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like approaching boots. The unknown, in this context, was far more terrifying than a clearly defined threat. John Miller's personal reflection on that night, therefore, was not unique, but rather a shared, collective experience. It was a moment of profound introspection for thousands of young men, many of whom had never faced such an existential threat before. They were caught in a historical crucible, unaware that they were standing on the precipice of one of the most significant and brutal battles of the war. The quiet night was not merely a prelude, it was an integral part of the battle itself, a psychological warfare waged in the darkness before the first shots were even fired. It forged a certain kind of resilience, a grim determination born out of the confrontation with the absolute unknown. The aftermath of that quiet night, the sudden explosion of violence, only served to amplify the memory of the stillness that preceded it. The contrast was stark, almost unbearable. The roar of German artillery, the terrifying sound of panzers grinding through the snow, the screams of men caught in the initial onslaught. All this was rendered even more horrific by the memory of the profound silence that had just been shattered. It was a brutal awakening, a violent transition from contemplation to chaos. Miller's story also highlights a crucial, often overlooked aspect of military history, the individual experience within the grand narrative. While strategists and historians focus on troop movements, logistical challenges, and command decisions, the soldier on the ground experiences war through a much narrower, more personal lens. For Miller, the Battle of the Bulge began not with a strategic briefing, but with a feeling, a premonition, a quiet dread that settled upon him as he stood guard in the freezing cold. This personal, sensory experience, the cold, the quiet, the fear, is what truly defines his understanding of the event. The enduring power of hope, even in the face of such overwhelming odds, is another central theme woven into Miller's account. Despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, there was always a flicker of hope. Hope for survival, hope for victory, hope for a return home. This hope wasn't a naive optimism. It was a stubborn, deeply ingrained human characteristic that allowed men to push beyond their limits, to endure unimaginable suffering, and to fight on even when all seemed lost. It was the hope that fueled their resilience, that allowed them to adapt to the brutal reality of the Ardennes, and ultimately, to prevail. The story of the Battle of the Bulge is replete with examples of this resilience. The besieged American forces at Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, famously responded to a German surrender demand with a single word: nuts. This defiant refusal, born out of sheer grit and determination, became a symbol of the American spirit during the battle. It was this same spirit, forged in the quiet moments of dread and then tested in the crucible of combat, that allowed soldiers like John Miller to hold their ground against a vastly superior enemy. The logistical nightmares that followed the initial German offensive also underscore the incredible adaptability of the Allied forces. Supply lines were severed, units were cut off, and the brutal winter weather made resupply efforts incredibly difficult. Yet, through sheer ingenuity and dogged perseverance, supplies were eventually airdropped, roads were cleared, and lines of communication were re-established. This logistical triumph, often overshadowed by the heroism of the frontline soldiers, was just as crucial to the eventual Allied victory. It demonstrated that resilience wasn't just a characteristic of individual soldiers, but of the entire military machine. Furthermore, the Battle of the Bulge exposed the profound human cost of war. The casualty figures were staggering, with tens of thousands of American and Allied soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The stories of those who perished, those who bore the physical and psychological scars of the battle, are a poignant reminder of the sacrifices made. John Miller's survival, his ability to recount his experiences, becomes a testament not only to his own courage but also a memorial to those who did not return. His narrative, therefore, serves as a bridge between the past and the present, allowing us to connect with the human realities of a conflict that often feels distant and abstract. The strategic implications of the Battle of the Bulge were also immense. While it initially caught the Allies off guard and created a dangerous bulge in their lines, it ultimately failed to achieve its objective of splitting the Allied forces and forcing a separate peace. Instead, it depleted Germany's last remaining reserves of men and materiel, accelerating the inevitable collapse of the Third Reich. The battle, therefore, was a desperate gamble that backfired spectacularly, costing Hitler precious resources and ultimately shortening the war. John Miller's last night before destiny was, in essence, the quiet prelude to the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The enduring legacy of the Battle of the Bulge extends beyond its strategic importance. It became a symbol of Allied unity and determination, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest hours, when surprise and overwhelming force were brought to bear, the democratic nations could stand firm and ultimately prevail. It cemented the reputation of the American soldier as a tenacious and resilient fighter, capable of extraordinary feats of courage under extreme pressure. In contemporary society, the stories from the Battle of the Bulge continue to resonate. They serve as powerful reminders of the fragility of peace, the importance of vigilance, and the enduring human capacity for both cruelty and courage. John Miller's narrative, with its focus on the quiet moments of introspection and fear, offers a valuable counterpoint to the often glorified narratives of war. It reminds us that heroism is not always about grand gestures. Sometimes it is simply about enduring, about holding on to hope in the face of despair, and about finding strength in the shared experience of suffering. The untold stories of war, like Miller's Quiet Night, are often the most profound. They reveal the intricate tapestry of human experience that lies beneath the surface of historical events. They show us that war is not just about battles and victories, but about individual lives, individual struggles, and the profound impact of extraordinary circumstances on ordinary people. By bringing these stories to light, we not only honor the sacrifices of the past, but also gain a deeper understanding of the human condition itself. The invitation to like this video, share it with others, and leave a comment below is more than just a call to engagement. It's an invitation to participate in the ongoing dialogue about history, memory, and the lessons learned from the past. It's an encouragement to reflect on the deeper meanings of conflict, to consider the individual human cost, and to appreciate the enduring power of hope and resilience in the face of adversity. John Miller's story, therefore, is not merely a historical account. It is a timeless narrative that speaks to the universal human experience, urging us to remember, to learn, and to strive for a future where such quiet nights of dread might never again precede such a destructive dawn. His journey from that quiet, cold night to the chaos of battle, and ultimately to a return to peace, encapsulates the profound arc of human endurance and the enduring spirit of hope that defines our shared history. This narrative, woven from the fabric of countless similar experiences, serves as a poignant reminder that the grand sweep of history is ultimately constructed from the intimate, often unrecorded, details of individual lives. It's a testament to the idea that true understanding of historical events requires delving beyond the headlines and into the hearts and minds of those who lived through them. Miller's Quiet Night, pregnant with unspoken fears and the chilling anticipation of impending violence, is a microcosm of the larger human drama that unfolds in every conflict. It underscores the psychological toll of war, often overlooked in favor of more tangible metrics like casualties and territorial gains. Consider the pervasive silence that often precedes major engagements, a silence that is not empty, but rather filled with the heavy breathing of men, the distant rumble of artillery, and the frantic whispers of prayers. This silence, as Miller experienced it, is a character in itself, a malevolent entity that amplifies every fear, every doubt, every flicker of hope. It's a silence that speaks volumes about the human condition under duress, a silence that forces an introspection rarely afforded in the clamor of daily life. This internal landscape, often neglected in historical accounts, is where the true battles are fought and won, or lost, long before the first shot is fired. The untold stories are not just about individual soldiers. They extend to the civilians caught in the crossfire, the families left behind, the communities shattered by the reverberations of conflict. Each one carries a unique perspective, a fragment of truth that, when pieced together, forms a more complete and nuanced understanding of war. Think of the letters written home, often censored, yet still imbued with the unspoken anxieties and affections of the sender, or the diaries kept in secret, recording observations and emotions too raw for public consumption. These are the primary sources that lend authenticity and emotional weight to historical narratives, allowing us to connect with the past on a deeply personal level. By emphasizing these individual narratives, we move beyond the abstract statistics and geopolitical analyses to confront the raw human cost of conflict. It's a shift from the macro to the micro, from the impersonal to the deeply personal. This approach is crucial for fostering empathy and preventing the dehumanization that often accompanies discussions of war. When we hear John Miller's quiet fears, we recognize our own vulnerabilities, our own capacity for dread, and our own innate desire for peace. This shared humanity becomes a bridge across time and circumstance, allowing us to learn from the past in a way that mere factual recitation cannot achieve. Furthermore, the act of seeking out and sharing these untold stories is an act of historical justice. It ensures that the experiences of those who might otherwise be forgotten are brought to light, their sacrifices acknowledged, and their wisdom preserved. It's a way of honoring not just the heroes, but also the ordinary individuals who, through their resilience and courage, shape the course of history. Their stories become cautionary tales, inspiring examples, and enduring testaments to the human spirit's capacity for both good and evil. The invitation to engage with this content, to like, share, and comment, is therefore more than a mere digital interaction. It's a call to communal reflection, a collective act of remembrance. In a world increasingly saturated with information, the ability to discern and appreciate narratives that resonate on a deeper, emotional level becomes paramount. These stories, like Miller's, possess an inherent power to transcend time and culture, offering insights into universal human experiences: fear, hope, loss, and resilience. They remind us that while the technologies of war may evolve, the fundamental human experience of conflict remains tragically constant. And in remembering these constants, we equip ourselves with the wisdom to strive for a future where the quiet dread of a soldier's night remains a relic of the past, rather than a recurring nightmare. The enduring echo of Miller's Quiet Night serves as a perpetual reminder that peace is not merely the absence of war, but a continuous, active pursuit, built upon the lessons learned from those who endured its most harrowing moments.